So, in layman's terms, they often talk about, I have a theory about why something happens, or I have a theory about that. And usually that's just somebody making a guess. And in science, a theory is something that is tested over and over and over again, and it's been modified to accommodate any new data in case the data doesn't quite fit what the theory says, and to adjust it. Evolution is, yes, it is a theory, but it is not wrong. It just can't prove everything correctly. And the way I will, the analogy I'll use to that is that of the theory of gravity. Okay, gravity is a theory. It is not a law. It is not a fact. And yeah, when we drop something, it falls to the floor. But gravity can't explain everything to 100% satisfaction of people. It has a really hard time explaining things that are really large, so like planetary bodies. And it has a hard time explaining things that are very, very small, like subatomic particles. Does that mean that gravity's wrong? No, it just means that gravity has some tweaking to do. It's got to be changed a little bit to make it really more precise. And the same thing with evolution. And I know there's a lot of, and I'm going to skip over some of these slides. Maybe start with this one here. Where's the moth? You see the moth there? There's some leaves, and that's the moth right there. But man, that looks like a leaf, doesn't it? Especially maybe if you're further back. If you're that bird further back, like Max there in the back row, and he's like, yeah, I can't tell. It looks like a leaf back there. You get up here a little closer, you can kind of see that it looks more like a moth than a leaf. But that is an adaptation. That species has adapted to look very similar to the leaf over time. And this is not something that happens, in a blink of an eye, but happens over generations. And that's what we're going to talk about. Charles Darwin is largely given credit for this idea of natural selection. But he wasn't the only one. There was actually several people that all at the same time were kind of coming up with this theory. But it was him that really published the research and really got the credit for it. So Darwin noted that current species appear to be descendants of other ancestor species that came before. And evolution, Darwin defined as every generation, every descent. Descent was generation. There was some modification. So every generation looked a little bit different. I like talking about Darwin. I don't know if it's really relevant, but I like talking about the history of this because there's there are a lot of players in here that contributed to it. And I like talking about some of the background. And we won't do all of it. This is just of a timeline. The timeline, this won't be on the test, just so you know. But I like to give this background to give you some more ideas of what's going on. So Aristotle, back in the day, said that species were fixed and did not change over time. And along with that was, Darwin was over in England, and they were, Christianity was a big thing, or is a big religion there. And the Old Testament of the Bible said that God designed all living things to be perfect. And therefore, let me go back. Because God designed everything, they must therefore be perfect. And so why would they change it over time? It doesn't make any sense. And so that was kind of a sticking point for him because of the fact that he didn't want to go up against the church. So that was a huge sticking point for him for a long time. Another guy by the name of Linnaeus interpreted adaptations as evidence that the creator had designed each species for a specific purpose. But he wasn't sure about their change over time. Linnaeus, the Linnaean taxification system, so kingdom, phylum, that stuff. You might take that when you get into college. If you study biology, you might take a class in like zoology, and you might have to learn that kind of stuff. He was the guy who developed the naming, the binomial structure, and this you should know, binomial format of a genus and a species name. And the genus is always capitalized. So this is my genus, and my species is lowercase. So if you see those two things together and it's in italics, then that tells you that you're looking at a species, a genus, and a species name. So like Homo sapien. Or I can't think of any other genus species names right off the top of my head. Yeah.
What is a genus?
So, the classification system that Linnaeus had started with the most broad scope that you could think of, kingdom. So we are in kingdom Animalia. And then we go down to phylum and class, and you get, as you go, you get narrower and narrower and narrower. So a species is just one group of organisms that have certain features, and we'll talk about what a species is. And then above that is a genus. So a genus is going to have several types of species within it, but they all have very similar traits to each other. And so because they're in that particular genus, they might have certain traits, and that makes them in a genus. And then you go up a little bit farther, and then they're a little bit less in common as you go up. So we are in the animal kingdom, but obviously there's lots and lots of different animals, and we're not very closely related to many of those animals. But if we talk about Homo sapiens, we can also talk about Homo habilis, Homo erectus. Those were all previous species of the genus Homo. They went extinct, and we did not. So we're all related, so to speak. We'll talk more about that when we get to phylogeny. Good question. So along with that classification thing, there was also the idea that there were fossils, and those fossils kind of laid the groundwork for some of Darwin's ideas, because it was like, well, wow, that fossil looks really similar to something we have today, but not exactly the same. So why is it gone? Did it just get destroyed? Is it gone now? Or did something happen to actually make it change in a certain way? It kind of goes over a little bit about fossils. We don't really need to worry too much about that. So you can find fossils in different layers of the ground. They call those layers strata. And the most recent ones typically are going to be at the top. And then as you dig farther and farther down, the layers below might have a completely different composition to them. And you typically have different types of fossils as well. That's assuming that there hasn't been any kind of moving of layers, which in today's world is kind of hard because everybody digs for foundations for houses, right? So dig a foundation for a house, all of a sudden those layers and layers of dirt are no longer in the same place. And so what was on the bottom might actually become on the top. Paleontology is the study of fossils. And so that field also helped Darwin with his ideas. Also important in here was the idea of the tectonic plates. So did they teach you tectonic plates in middle school? Yeah, I feel like they still do that, right? So the Earth is actually made up of layers of material that slide, they move. And as they move, they can either move on top of one another, they can move under one another. If they move on top of one another, you get a mountain. So like Mount Everest is getting taller every year because there's one plate that's pushing against the other one, and it's pushing the other plate upward, and it's making Mount Everest get taller. Out on the West Coast, we see California. California, there's two plates and one's going underneath the other one. And it's starting to butt into it. And every time it butts into it a little bit, it causes an earthquake. Okay? But over time, we know that the continents were not always where they are now. At one point, they were together. They were actually together. But they slid, they moved. These tectonic plates moved over time. And so that was another big piece to Darwin's thinking. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Lamarck had his own idea of how species evolve. And his idea was that when something happened during the lifetime of an organism, that would get passed down to the next generation. So, for example, if you were a very sedentary person, and you didn't really, do much with your legs, you just kind of sat all the time. You didn't really do much with your legs. Your legs, over time, would atrophy, and the muscles would get weaker, and that trait would get passed on to your kids. Okay, or even, it sounds crazy, but let's say I lose a finger, that would then get passed down to my children, because now I don't have a finger, and that trait would get passed on. So that was Lamarck's idea. That is kind of important. That really wasn't shown to be very true. It hasn't been supported by evidence, and I think this guy with the bonsai tree is trying to show that when you get seeds for a bonsai tree and you plant them, the bonsai tree just wants to bush everywhere. It doesn't look all nice and neat like this man has sculpted it. Okay, this is a nice, beautiful bonsai plant that he sculpted, but the seeds that were produced by this plant would not, you plant them, they would not produce a sculpted plant. Instead, the plant would just be bushing out all over the place, and it would not look like this. And you'd have to, again, go through the steps of making it look like this one here. Okay, so there was some doubt about the permanence of species even prior to Darwin. And that kind of set the stage for him. As a boy, he was very interested in nature. He first studied medicine, not so well, and then he studied theology. And afterwards, imagine this guy's young. He's like, I don't know, 20 years old. I don't know exactly how old they were when they graduated. And his parents are like, when are you going to get out of the house? When are you going to do something? I'm like, well, I just want to sit here and play video. Oh, no, they wouldn't be playing video games. But, I don't know what he's doing. And his parents are like, you need to get a job. And so his parents actually hooked him up with an unpaid position. Oh, I didn't realize it was unpaid. Poor guy. With a 5-year voyage to go around the world. And he was a naturalist. His idea was that he was supposed to catalog all the things that he saw whenever they made land. So he would catalog the fish and the birds and the seaweed and everything, plants. And so he took this trip around the world. It took him 5 years to do it. And you can kind of look at his journey here. And it's not really important what his journey was. The part that I think is very interesting about this whole thing is that he'd never stepped on a boat before. And he fortunately stepped on a boat a little bit too late to find out that he suffered from seasickness. And so he was seasick for 5 years. If you can imagine being sick to your stomach all that time. So whenever they hit land, he was like the first guy off the boat. He's like, yeah, get me the heck on the shore. I need to. So he spent a lot of time off the boat and working and looking at cataloging things. And there is some speculation that, well, they say that he was never quite the same when he came back. It would be pretty tough to have that happen to you, where you were, sick to your stomach, feeling like you're going to vomit for, a good portion of 5 years. he was on this ship called the Beagle. Again, you don't have to know that name. Just kind of fun. If you have a dog, you can name it. If you have a Beagle, you can name it Darwin. Do you guys know Miss Fear? Anybody? No. She's a teacher here, and she used to have a Beagle, and she named it Darwin. Anyway, so he noticed that he was looking at fossils, and he noticed that the fossils looked a lot like the living species from other regions. And then also, when he went from port to port, adjacent areas tended to have species that looked a lot alike. Not necessarily the same species, but species that look very similar. He also had an experience of an earthquake that happened in Chile, and that he saw that all of a sudden there was this movement of rock and things were moving around, which went back to that whole tectonic plate idea that they were still developing at that time. And that's where he studied Lyell's geology. So this was another huge thing that back in his day, people said the Earth was less than 6,000 years old. And that, again, it lined up with the Bible. So the Bible basically stated that, we're very new on this planet. Everybody's very new on this planet. And then he started reading this geology book and said, no, actually, the world's a lot older than 6,000 years. It's like billions of years old. He's like, whoa, wait, really? Seriously? And then kind of the key thing that you may have learned about before, I know they used to teach us in middle school, but I don't know if they do anymore, the Galapagos Islands. He spent a lot of time at these islands, which are on the west coast of South America. And he found all of these. Well, first of all, he hypothesized that these islands were once together, and they were all grouped together in a single unit. And over time, the tectonic plates caused them to spread apart. The Hawaiian Islands are actually formed because of a hot spot. It is a weakness in the plate of the Earth that magma will come up out of the ocean and cause an eruption, and then it cools and it creates land, and that keeps forming until you get an island. But then over time, the plates keep shifting, and so those islands, we keep getting more and more islands over time. And we're talking hundreds of millions of years, not, we just created another island overnight. It takes a very long time for that to happen. But Hawaiian Islands are an example of that. With the Galapagos, he actually thought that they were all together at one point. And then what happened is they broke apart as the tectonic plates moved. And the reason that was kind of important was because he studied, his big thing was he studied in detail these finches, birds. And he took lots of specimens home with him. And just see if I'm jumping ahead of myself here. I'm not sure. Okay. So he took a lot of specimens home with him. And a lot of them were very similar to each other. And he thought they were probably all the same species. Meaning that by our definition that we haven't really given yet, a species is a group of birds or a group of organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. That's the kind of the working definition of a species. And he took a whole bunch of these birds back home, and there were some of them that were eating cactus, and some of them were eating insects, some of them were eating seeds, and depending on what they were eating, their beaks were different shaped. So, for example, the seed eater tended to have a more robust, a wider, a deeper, chunkier beak than one that had to pick up little tiny insects. Maybe little insects might be hard to get the insects if your beak is too wide. It wouldn't be easy to get those little tiny insects. So he went back to When he finally got back after his 5-year voyage, he showed these to people zoologists who knew what they were talking about in terms of ornithology, which is the study of birds, and said that, yeah, no, you've actually got like 20 different species of birds here. He's like, what? Really? That's really weird. And so then it was like, okay, well, they look alike, but they're not alike. They're slightly adapted to different parts of the world or different parts of the island. So in 1844, Darwin wrote an essay on natural selection, which was basically this idea that over time, depending on what the environment was like, the species changed. And we'll talk more about what that means and give you a much more concrete idea, definition of natural selection. But the thing was, he came up with it in 1844, and I put that in large letters because he didn't take it public for a long time. I don't know what he's going to say. Yeah. It wasn't until 1858 that he decided, well, yeah, he got a manuscript from another guy who respected him a lot, a younger man, by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. And he basically developed the same theory as Darwin, but they were completely independent of each other because Darwin had never published his thoughts. And so Darwin actually then thought, oh, maybe I should publish this. And what's not listed in here is he actually published it with Wallace. So he gave Wallace credit too. But for whatever reason, Darwin got the credit. We only remember Darwin, but Wallace also was thinking that way as well, as a lot of other people were. So it's kind of a weird thing in science that sometimes these things, there's like this critical mass, and then the next thing you know, everybody is kind of on the same page. And so a lot of people were on the same page with Darwin about this idea that things aren't fixed, that things must change over time. How? He didn't the other people didn't necessarily know, but they were on the same page that things did change over time. So The Origin of Species was this book that Darwin published, and it basically had 3 observations. One is that the idea of life comes from, where all living things come from a common ancestor. Yet life is very diverse. Things are very, very different. And why is that? And then the idea is that, the reason they're diverse is because they're suited to different environments. And so those different birds on those different islands had slightly different habitats. One island might be a little more dry, and so you have cactus developing on that island, and so you need a different kind of beak, as opposed to one that might be wetter. Maybe it was closer to the coast, and there were, you had to pick out little tiny things out of mud, out of the dirt, and because of that, maybe you needed a really thin beak to get at those things. So they're all similar, and they come from the same place, but they're different because they have adapted to their environment. Darwin never used the word evolution when he had his first version of Origin of Species. He used the phrase descent with modification. Oops, right there. Sorry. The phrase refers to the view that all organisms are related through descent from an organism, from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. And Darwin viewed every living thing as kind of being like a tree, where you had like a main trunk, and then from there you had branching off, and depending on what environment a particular group was in, they would have different characteristics. And so this is actually from his book. And he's got this one main trunk, and then he's got one species coming off here. He's got all these branches coming off. And it turned out he was kind of spot on about a lot of this. Doesn't look much like a tree, but you get the idea that you've got a one branch, you've got one trunk, and out of that came many, many different species. All right. I am going to stop there